Which is the fastest and best route for the Falcons offense making big improvement?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Oh, welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka the iron that sharpens the iron, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast. Been podcasting for over a decade, and I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me, whether you've been listening since 2011 or you just started listening, at 2:11 p.m. a.m. today. And all of you, regardless of how long you've been listening to the podcast, I consider everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. All you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we are breaking down routes, right? We're all about routes today. I wanted to do this looking at a bunch of the different routes that the wide receivers were winning on. This was sort of piggybacking on the conversation which led to this, which was, how do we get more out of Kyle Pitts? We'll talk about that later in the episode. We'll look at all the different wide receivers, but in the process of doing this research on all the various receivers, I was doing some research on the Falcons passing attack as a whole. And so let's talk about the quarterbacks and which routes that they are best at throwing or worst at throwing. And, I got this research and data via FTN Fantasy. For those of you that do not know, ftnfantasy.com, from what I understand, most of the people that used to work at Football Outsiders now work for FTN Fantasy. So they have a lot of great data, if you're willing to pay a nominal fee to get access to that, not only to improve your fantasy team, but also, to get all this stat nerd stuff, analytics stuff that we'll be breaking down on today's episode. But, they chart every throw based off of 13 different routes, right? They categorize every throw based off of 13 different routes. You have the screen, you have the slant, you have the swing pass, you have the drag, you have the quick out, the deep out, the wheel, the hitch/curl, you have the in/dig, you have the post, you have the corner, you have the go. And then the last route is the Texas/angle route, which is primarily a running back route, which we won't be spending much time talking about today when we're talking about wide receivers. But they also keep track of expected points added per target based off of that route. And we have some graphics for you guys. And let's look at sort of how often Kirk versus Michael Penix were throwing certain routes compared to the NFL average. And as you can see on your screens, if you're checking us out on YouTube, this is a great day to check us out on YouTube. If you're an audio listener, if you would like to look at these graphics, I'll do my best to explain some of the highlights of these graphics. But with Kirk Cousins, for the most part, when it came to various routes, he wasn't too dissimilar from the league average, right? For most routes, in terms of the percentage of throws, his target rate, percentage of throws that he made based off of these various routes, he was within like 1% to 3% for the most part on pretty much every route. The biggest gap that he had from what the NFL norm was to what he threw this past season in Atlanta was the drag route. And the drag route, for those of you that don't know, is that shallow crosser that basically runs right behind the D line in between the linebacker. And Kirk, only about 1.5% of his throws this past year were drag routes, versus the league average, which was about 6.6%. Now, when you look at Michael Penix, given the smaller sample size, it's a little bit wonkier, right? There's a wider degree of variance, and we imagine that some of these things will normalize, when we look at the data from 2025, when he's, hopefully throwing 400, 500, maybe hopefully not 600 passes, but some number in that regard. But sort of two routes really stand out from pretty far off the norm when it came to Michael Penix, which is the quick out, where Penix threw that pass about half as much as the league average, about 9%, versus 18%. He threw it 9% of the time. The league average was 18% of the time. And then the deep out, where Penix threw that ball a much more than the league average, about 2.5 times. He threw it 19% of the time, and the league average is about 7% of the time. And, on those drag routes, Penix threw the ball close to league average, about 6% versus 6.6%. Now, when we look at how effective each one of these quarterbacks were, Kirk versus Penix, on these routes, we're looking at that based off of EPA per target, based off of these 13 routes that FTN Fantasy has. And when we compare Kirk's EPA per target to the NFL average, his best routes that he threw last year were the slants, the post, and the wheel. His worst route was the in/dig and the corner, right? And then Penix's best routes compared to the NFL average, he threw the in/dig better than league average. So that's an improvement from Kirk to Penix. The corner, another area where Kirk was struggling. And then you have the Texas/angle route where he was much better than the league average, but he only threw one of those, but it was only one attempt. So that's where we get into the sort of sample size, sort of messing with the data a little bit. So we'll throw that out of the way. So basically the conclusion is Kirk's worst routes, the in or dig route and the corner route, were Penix's best routes. Now, Penix's worst routes were the quick out, the post, and the wheel. So both Kirk and Penix struggled with the post and the wheel. Penix struggled on the quick out. Kirk struggled on the slant. And in this case, Penix wasn't throwing a ton of posts and wheel. He only threw 3 posts and 1 wheel route. So again, that is not necessarily indicative of the reality of the situation with a larger sample size. But when we talk about Michael Penix, he struggled, relatively speaking, with that sort of quick out. Again, not a huge sample size, 9 throws, but a little bit more indicative of reality than necessarily 1 or 2 throws. And his EPA per target on those quick outs was a -1, minus 0.4 per target. And the NFL average was slightly positive at 0.03. But that gets to what we've discussed many times on this podcast this offseason, where one of the things that we need to see improvements from Michael Penix is that, ability to hit those, underneath throws with accuracy and timing. And, when we had Will McFadden on the podcast last week, and he was talking about how Penix had a little bit of a sloppy day. And, I joked with Will because the team, there were video put out from people on hand in practice showing Penix throwing some of those out patterns and missing some of those throws. And of course, that prompts a panic or whatever, but it's sort of indicative of like, hey, this is a route that Penix needs to improve on. And the reason why is because that was the route that the Falcons threw the most last year. Now, again, a lot of that was because that was Kirk's preferred throw based off of his target rate, but that's also the most popular throw in the NFL. And when you look at the 6 most thrown routes in the NFL, right? Number 1, you have the quick out, right? At, something like 17%. The hitch/curl is number 2. The screen is number 3. The in or dig route is number 4. Number 5 is the go route, and the deep out is that 6th route, right? And those 6 throws, based off of the FTN fantasy data, account for almost 70% of all throws made in the NFL last year, right? And so when you look at those 6 routes and you look at Penix's efficiency on those routes, right? Like, 3 of those, the quick out, the hitch, the screen are, shorter underneath throws, while the dig is more of an intermediate throw, right? And the go and the deep ball and the deep out are, vertical throws, right? Down the field type of throws. And the 3 underneath throws, Penix performance was underperformed by NFL standards. Right? The dig, he was above NFL standards based off of the league average last year. And the 2 vertical throws, he was above NFL standards. And so it gets back to what we've been talking about, right? We're not losing sleep over the deep stuff with Michael Penix, but it's the underneath stuff that we need to see more efficiency with. And, as we've talked many times, NFL teams, opposing teams get coached too, and they're going to try to find ways to scheme away the deep stuff by playing 2 high coverages. We saw how defenses adjusted to Penix in his first 3 starts, right? We spent coming out of that Week 17 game against Washington, we talked about how Penix struggled against Tampa 2. So what did Carolina do? They came out and played a lot of Tampa 2. Now, Penix picked that Tampa 2 apart, and that was a big reason. And that's a promising sign for his future when it comes to processing, right? A coverage that he struggled diagnosing one week, he was able to diagnose at a high level the next week. But at the end of the day, you still got to make the throw. So we don't question Penix's processing ability. We question whether or not he's going to consistently make those throws. And so, if other teams are looking at his inefficiencies on some of these underneath throws, guess what they're going to try to force him to do? They're going to try to force him to dink and dunk. And you need Penix to be efficient in those situations. You need your run game to be effective in those situations, which will then hopefully force teams to say, okay, we got to drop that safety down from those 2 high shells to stop the run. And then that's going to open up that deep ball that Penix is going to be able to hit at a high level. So you can clearly see the path forward for what this offense can be under Michael Penix. You just got to walk that path, right? And really, again, a lot of that relies on Penix being more efficient on some of those underneath throws and, the quick outs and those types of things. So, this conversation originated with me looking at the wide receivers and wanting to break those guys down by route. And so let's look at the wide receivers and let's discuss where, Drake London, Ray McCloud, and Darnell Mooney have the most potential to grow this upcoming season. So the NBA Finals are just around the corner. Thursday night, depending on when you're listening to this, and every night's going to deliver highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. And if you are invested in this NBA Finals and you're new to FanDuel, it is a perfect time to sign up. Head on over to FanDuel.com, and when you place your first $5 bet, if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets to use on a variety of different things, right? FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game, whether it's before tip-off or during the game. When you're looking at this Pacers versus Thunder matchup, you can go to FanDuel and you can not only bet on who's going to win it all, who's going to win Finals MVP, or you can just say, hey, I just want to take it one game at a time, and I just want to start with who I think is going to win game one, who I think is most likely to hit that triple-double. There's so many ways to win at FanDuel. So head on over to FanDuel.com, and again, that first $5 bet, if it wins, you get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So we have more graphics. And these are inspired by a friend of the show, Matt Harmon, who does Reception Perception. And so we're looking at the 12 routes that I mentioned before for these wide receivers. And for those of you that need a reminder on the audio side of things, we're talking screen, slant, swing, drag, quick out, deep out, wheel, hitch, dig, post, corner, go, right? No Texas, no angle routes, right? So when we're looking at these 12 routes for these wide receivers, we're looking at Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Ray McCloud, and comparing their production based off of EPA per target to NFL averages. And to illustrate their efficiency on each one of these routes, I came up with, just a metric, just playing around with it, EPA above replacement, right? So basically looking at EPA per target for all NFL receivers based off of these 12 routes, and then looking at the difference between each one of the Falcons receivers on those routes in that same metric, and then multiplying that number, that difference, by how many targets they had to basically give, the idea of like, this is how many points this receiver is adding on this specific route, or in losing on this specific route. And when we look at Drake London, right, he ran the hitch / curl the most, 32 times, but his EPA per target on those routes was about 0.073. The NFL average on the hitch / curl is about 0.225. So Drake is losing about 0.15 points per target on that route. And if you multiply that by the 32 routes he ran, that's where you get where Drake lost 4.9 points on when he ran a hitch / curl. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that this metric is like the end all be all, the best way to measure wide receivers, but it's the best way I could illustrate it because, when we look at, reception perception from Matt Harmon, he does success rate on his thing. Didn't have the FTM fantasy, didn't provide success rate per route on this thing. So, before we get into the specifics of each of these guys, it's worth noting that overall, Darnell Mooney added 13.5 points above replacement, if you want to say that. compared to NFL wide receivers. Drake London lost 1.7 points, and Ray McCloud lost 12.7 points. And so, as a reminder for EPA, expected points added, it tends to favor explosive plays, first downs, touchdowns. So we shouldn't be surprised that Darnell Mooney excelled in this made-up metric that I've come up with, because he was one of the most explosive wide receivers in the NFL last year. Right, Drake London was solid due to his ability to move the chains, also being a factor in the red zone. But because he wasn't generating as many explosive plays, he doesn't look nearly as good in this metric. And then Ray wasn't really checking any of the boxes that you're looking for, whether it's the explosive plays, whether it's the moving the chains, whether it's being a red zone threat. And so he does not look very good in this metric. So there's no agendas, didn't come up with this metric just so I could slander Ray McCloud or anything like that. But it does, I think, further illustrate why you hear me believe, again, I didn't think this because of this metric, but it does underline what I previously thought, which is Ray's probably ideally suited to be a wide receiver 4, not necessarily a wide receiver 3. And when you look at, when he was in the most effective version, the most effective offense he's been in, which is that San Francisco 49ers offense that he was in for 2 years when they were a top 5 offense, he was only getting less than 5% of the targets. And you compare that to last year in Atlanta, where he was getting 15.6% of the target share. And as you may recall, when we discussed this earlier this week with Kyle Pitts, that 15.6% is what we want Kyle Pitts to have this upcoming season. And so we want to throw the ball less to Ray and throw the ball more to Kyle Pitts, but we'll circle back to Kyle Pitts a little bit later. But let's get into how each of these guys win. Drake was at his best on the slants. He added 11 points on slant routes, added 7 points on deep outs, and 7 points on quick outs, where Drake needs to improve. He lost 4.9 points on hitches/curls, as I explained earlier, lost 4 points on digs, lost 3.5 points on posts, lost 5 points on goes, and 9 points on corner routes. And so when you're looking at this on your screens, you're seeing a lot of red on Drake's vertical route tree, especially, and that's an area that we hope to see improvement from Drake. And I'd wager if I went back and did this same data and research for previous years under Drake, we'd probably have better results on those vertical routes. And so that's when we think Drake's play can improve. It's going to be generating more of those explosive plays down the field, winning on those 50-50 balls, those back shoulder fades that we've seen Drake win on consistently in the past, but was not necessarily a featured part of the Falcons offense in regards to how the Falcons were playing with Drake London last year. Now, Darnell Mooney did a little bit better job on those vertical routes, but his best routes, he added 9 points on the post, 5.5 points on the go, and 2.3 points on the quick out. He needs to improve probably the most on the dig, where he lost about 3.4 points. And it's kind of reminiscent to what I remember Calvin Ridley's sort of, Calvin, not going to rehash this whole thing, but like when Arthur Smith came in and was like, we're going to run dig routes to Calvin Ridley. It's like, that's not what Calvin Ridley does. And we talked about how Darnell Mooney's really good on like the deep outs and all that other stuff. But, I figured he'd be better on the deep outs. He lost 2.1 points on the deep outs. And I think probably some of that is probably owed to, potentially, I think some of these back shoulder fades being counted as deep outs. Don't always know exactly where FTN Fantasy, how they chart things. But, that was an area where Mooney was kind of a little bit more hit and miss on some of those back shoulder fades and whatnot. But it does illustrate how much better Mooney was as a vertical receiver this past year in Atlanta than he was after several lackluster years in Chicago. And we'll see what areas where Mooney can improve upon. Again, I think consistency could be better, but for the most part, I'm like, no notes. I don't need Darnell Mooney to be catching digs and screens and all that stuff. I don't want to see improvement because I don't want to see that many of those passes for him. But looking at Ray McCloud, he was best on those digs, adding 6.1 points on digs, adding 1.6 points on deep outs. He needs improvement on the quick out, where he lost 5.6 points, and the screen, where he lost 3.3 points. And that illustrates where those dagger concepts that we've talked about before were kind of money for Ray McCloud. They loved running those dagger concepts. And for those of you that don't know what the dagger concept is, it's when you have an outside receiver that runs a dig, and then you have the inside receiver run a vertical sort of clear out route, and it opens up that throw pretty easily. And the other thing that kind of stands out looking at the numbers, which is looking at how many times the Falcons were asking each of these receivers to run various routes compared to the NFL average. And London ran a relatively normal route tree. He was within like 1 to 3% on in terms of the percentage of his routes that were each route by NFL averages, according to wide receiver. There was 2 exceptions. Only 1.3% of his routes were screen passes. The NFL average for wide receivers last year was 8.6%. 2.5% of his routes were drags. The NFL average was 7%. Mooney had one route that stood out, that deep out. 21.5% of his routes were that deep out. The NFL average is 10%. His other route that stood out was he ran a lot less slants. Only 1% of his routes were slants. The NFL average is 8%. McCloud majored in screens and digs, right? Those dagger concepts, right? 47% combined of his routes were screen or digs when the NFL average for a wide receiver is about 19%. So hopefully we can turn some of those deeper throws green for Drake London. And I think that could do wonders for this offense in terms of its explosive potential, where you have 2 guys that can win down the field with Drake and Darnell when those opportunities come. Because again, we're expecting defenses to play the Falcons a certain way. And if the defenses are forcing the Falcons to dink and dunk, I think that's a great opportunity for a player like Drake London to really thrive this year as the team's go-to chain mover and possession receiver on those underneath routes, on those intermediate routes that the Falcons will probably have to throw more of with Penix at the helm. So, there's another guy on the offense that could potentially help on those underneath and intermediate routes, and that's going to get us to Kyle Pitts, and we'll break down his route tree as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So did the same basic exercise with Kyle Pitts, comparing him against NFL tight ends as opposed to wide receivers. And in terms of EPA above replacement, the Falcons lost 4.7 points every time Kyle Pitts was targeted compared to the NFL average tight end. That's not a great number, but it's not disastrous. It's not, losing 2 touchdowns like it was with Ray this past year. But there's a lot of yellow when you look at Kyle Pitts' route tree on the graphics on your screen, which basically means that Kyle Pitts was mostly average and mostly slightly below average, where he was losing mostly points, but very small amount of points. And this is why, I always tend to push back when people call Pitts like a massive bust. And I say, look, it's not great, but he's basically still an average starting tight end. And I know that's a massive disappointment, considering, the expectations were that he was going to be the greatest tight end ever based off of where we selected him. But again, that's a perfect opportunity to remind folks that you gotta, reset your expectations and not let them screw with you when it comes to these players. And this is why you've heard me talk in the past about, we don't judge players based off of where they got drafted. We judge them based off of how they do on the field. And I think Pitts is a good player, but he certainly could do better than what we're seeing from this past year. And hopefully the Falcons will be able to get him to do better this upcoming season. The only green route that Pitts has is the corner route, which we saw him thrive on a number of times this past year, at least during that 6-game stretch when he was a featured part of the offense. He added 4.8 points on the corner route. His worst route was the quick out, where the Falcons lost 6.7 points when they threw to Kyle Pitts, and the go ball, where they lost 3.3 points. But everything else, as I said, is basically between losing 0.2 points and 1.8 points, which isn't a huge number. So that's where all the yellow comes from. And I didn't necessarily run the numbers from the previous years, but I did, sort of skim the numbers when looking at some of those dig routes when Pitts was playing under Arthur Smith, and it felt like he was more effective in that. And I think that's an opportunity for where the Falcons can get Pitts more involved, running some of those dagger concepts with Kyle Pitts instead of Ray McCloud. And Pitts lost 0.8 points on those digs. And obviously that was the route that McCloud excelled in, but I don't know if that was because, something specific to Ray McCloud's skill set. I think a lot of that was more the scheme, where you have Darnell Mooney running the vertical clear outs from the inside, and Ray McCloud, running that dagger behind it. And I also think, some of these, kind of the mirror opposite of the dig route is these Ohio or Sale concepts, where you have an outside receiver running a vertical and the inside receiver, in this case, potentially Kyle Pitts as an inline tight end, running that out pattern. And we saw that work effectively for Kyle Pitts in the past in 2023. And again, on those deep outs, Kyle Pitts was basically league average, losing 0.2 points on those deep outs. So I think those are two areas where we could see growth for Kyle Pitts. And I would imagine if I went back and looked at the numbers, we would probably see better results in previous years when he was asked to run more of those routes. And so hopefully we'll see Kyle Pitts turn some of these routes from yellow to green. Will he? We'll have to sort of see, but it's the same conversation we're having about Michael Penix, where it's like we need to see Michael Penix be better underneath. And the question is, will he? We'll have to see. But obviously, I think, there's reasons for people to be optimistic. And, never been my point that Kyle Pitts is secretly a great player, all right? And this data certainly does not show that. But I do think he's a very valuable asset, and I think it's in the Falcons' best interest to maximize that asset for however long he is remaining with the Atlanta Falcons. And if Pitts doesn't step up, then so be it. But you're not going to be able to convince me that the best path forward for the Falcons when it comes to who's their fourth best option after the big three, which is Bijan Robinson, Drake London, and Darnell Mooney, is Ray McCloud. I'm like, all right, good luck with that. No offense, Ray, but he is what he is. But if you're trying to convince me that that's the best version of the Falcons offense, I'm like, nah, the best version is where Kyle Pitts is that fourth option and he's playing well. Now we'll see if we get that version this upcoming season. And again, I think that's on the coaching staff and Kyle Pitts, in addition to get that out of there. But that's where we'll end this route tree breakdown and conversation. Still got tons of data that we can potentially dig into, and we will do so all summer long. Right. One of the things I want to look at that at least the film showed me is, how does Michael Penix handle man coverage? Because if you are facing a quarterback that has accuracy concerns, and this is often the case in the NFL with young quarterbacks, is teams like to play a lot of man coverage that forces those guys to have to throw into tighter windows. And I want to look at, the data to see how Penix performed against man coverage and zone coverage last year, relative to the rest of the league. So that will be something worth digging into as the summer unfolds, as well as getting more guests on to talk about Michael Penix and share their thoughts on their young quarterback, the Falcons' young quarterback, and this team's future outlook. So those are all things in store for you in all summer long. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. For tomorrow's episode, I believe we will get into some insight from Locked On Sooners about Billy Bowman. That is on deck for you tomorrow. So make Locked On Falcons your first listen by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting podcast with Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs. And I'm sure at some point those guys have been talking about, what is the best place to send Kyle Pitts? Who's the team that should trade for Kyle Pitts? I know Kyle has been talking about that as Locked On Dolphins, talking about Jonnu Smith destinations and all that. And so I'm sure he has some thoughts on some potential Kyle Pitts landing spots that maybe be able to turn his route tree into green elsewhere. But, in addition to, trade rumors and trade assets, Kyle and Joe are going to give you that insight that's going to get you geared up for training camp and, make you just more knowledgeable about the league as a whole. So check out Locked On NFL Scouting with the Draft Dudes. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.